Hello, I'm Ben Orchard.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick.
Welcome to Sword, Sorcery and Synthesizers, the 80s fantasy movie podcast. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm in Brisbane.
But through the wonders of modern technology and the magic of Skype, we meet each week to discuss some beloved movie of a bygone era and see what lies behind the nostalgia. Well, here we are podcasting again after a nice, long, refreshing Christmas break.
Good to get back into it. Good to also have a break, which is also awesome.
When I was walking around my local shopping centre looking for presents during the Christmas break for various different people, I saw all kinds of merchandising for the film Wicked, the film of the Broadway musical, which was a prequel to The Wizard of Oz. So there were Wicked board games, Wicked clothing. You could get a witch's broom, lots of things.
This is Wicked.
Well, it was a huge box office hit, and the Oscar nominations have been announced for 2025. It's got some Oscar buzz surrounding it. And that reminded me that 2025 is also the 40th anniversary of another film set in L. Frank Baum's, wonderful world of Oz, Return to Oz.
Mm-hmm. Which is so weird, but in the best way. I think so. So very different also to The Wizard of Oz that most people are familiar with, the 30s version. So
it's funny how you mention how it's so very different to the 1930s film version. In many ways, the 1985 film Return to Oz is actually more faithful to L. Frank Baum's novels. Although it's not a sort of perfect adaptation, nonetheless, it tries very hard to capture the spirit of his writing. I'd say probably a lot harder than the 30s film did.
Well, I think a lot of people, I think it's kind of common for people to say that they prefer it to the MGM's Wizard of Oz because it's sort of more truer to the original Oz books. So I think maybe as, a literary purist or someone who's really into the books, that's probably why they prefer it. Just speculating.
Well, the funny thing about L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz series is that it was something of a cash cow during his lifetime. And for a while, he was sort of forced to keep churning out Oz books just to make money because none of his other novels were selling that well. He wrote over a dozen Oz books during his lifetime. But the thing is, these days, most people have only read the first book in the series. And that's the only one that sort of is generally brought up in casual discussion and has a lot of literary analysis brought to bear on it. When it comes to the broader pop culture landscape, the 1930s film has eclipsed it in terms of renown. I'd say more people are familiar with the 1930s film even today than are familiar with anything Baum wrote about Oz.
Do you think it's also because, it became a cult classic, but there are so many things that happened during the filming? It's just, I don't know, do you think it's because of the actors, because of the time it was made, or combination, or something different, or, people just familiar with it?
I think it's a combination of different things. It was a very technically innovative film, the 1930s movie, in terms of its use of color and sound. Also, it featured many iconic performances, but also it has so many iconic moments in it. And a lot of those iconic moments are unique to the film. the things that people associate with Oz, like the Wicked Witch of the West having green skin or the ruby slippers, these are things created for the film. They're not things that were in the original Baum novels.
Yeah, because I know the slippers are actually silver, and I don't think the witch had green skin.
No, she
Mm,
didn't.
yeah, so it's actually interesting that they continue that with Wicked and other depictions, like, artistic things or just anything else depicting the Wicked Witch of the West, always green. So I find that really interesting that that's become like a cultural norm or just the norm in general that the Wicked Witch of the West is green.
And she has a pointed hat. I believe in the original illustrations in the Baum Oz book, she wears a hooded cloak and has an eye patch. But yes, most of the derivative works that have followed in the wake of the 1930s film draw more upon the film than on the book. The one big difference between Baum's books and the 1930s film is that well, for me anyway, the core thematic difference is that in Baum's novels, Oz is unambiguously a real place. It isn't just a dream. It's not just something that Dorothy has imagined in her head. It's a place that she can go back to. And eventually her whole family moves there and lives there permanently. So the way that, the 1930s film ends with her waking up and it's all just a dream and she says, "Oh, there's no place like home." I mean, just that very phrase, "there's no place like home," gets in my craw as someone who used to read the Oz books as a kid and remembers how, like, Dorothy and her family eventually decided, screw Kansas, we'll just move to Oz.
Well, I mean, what's so exciting about living in Kansas? There's just, tornadoes everywhere, squashing, poor innocent women with houses.
You're not a twister chaser then. I mean, that doesn't excite.
No, it doesn't.
But here's the thing. The 1930s film being so iconic meant that when in 1985 Return to Oz was made, and they tried to make a more conscious effort to go back to the source material and produce something that was more faithful to the source material. A lot of people complained that, this isn't like the Judy Garland film. Where's the colorful visuals and, singing and dancing, where's all of like, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion appear, but it's basically cameos at the end. It's mostly focused on completely new characters.
Which I think is good. And like, I know there are mixed kind of views of it. But one of the things that I thought was interesting of like a good review and what I liked was that it duplicates kind of like the magic of the Wizard of Oz. But it also has like a lot more of Baum kind of storytelling, I think. A lot more of the magical kind of aspects to it. Obviously, like, Dorothy is an insomniac, so it's a bit darker and stuff like that. And I know a few people also said that a lot of it doesn't make sense, but I think it's really cool.
Well, the storyline for this movie is that, Dorothy tells everyone about her adventures in Oz, and she has trouble sleeping. And naturally, her aunt and uncle think that she's, maybe traumatized by the experience of the Twister, and she's, uh, perhaps needs some psychological help. So they book her into this asylum where the head doctor is trying out this newfangled thing called electroshock therapy. But before Dorothy can be zapped, a flood happens and sweeps her away back to Oz, where it turns out that Oz has been taken over by the cruel Gnome King and an evil witch named Mombi, and anyone who dares to resist them has been turned into stone. And she has to, uh, stand up to these tyrants and set things to rights. And she does so with the help of some colorful new sidekicks. There's Jack Pumpkinhead, a walking, talking Halloween decoration. There's TikTok this wind-up mechanical soldier, and there's Gump, which is basically this flying moose head, and and she has a new animal sidekick this time, a sassy chicken named Belina, who gains the ability to talk when she's swept up to Oz with Dorothy. The other sort of like weird creatures and antagonists that she encounters, like there's the Wheelers who have like wheels instead of hands and feet, and they have this sort of punk attitude, a bit like a Clockwork Orange. And then I mentioned Mombi, and she has these detachable heads.
Do you know, I was thinking, because all these things, like, are so bizarre. And yeah, and I was thinking about how in it that her aunt and uncle, obviously don't believe that she went to Oz, think that she's like too caught up in the fantasies of it, and think that she's crazy. Like they sent her to get electroshock treatment, things like that. To progressive new treatment, everything like that. But I think obviously if a child is telling you about all these crazy things, surely you're going to be like, you need some help. But then I found it interesting when she goes back to Oz that the extra sidekicks, extra characters are even more bizarre. So can you imagine if that happens like the first time round?
Well, a lot of this bizarre imagery is actually taken directly from Baum's books, believe it or not. The approach that writers Gil Dennis and Walter Murch took to adapting Baum's books was basically they combined the plots of the second and third Oz books rather than just doing a straight adaptation of the second book, The Marvelous Land of Oz.
Yeah.
Which, let me tell you about that book. In the Marvelous Land of Oz, it's mostly Dorothy doesn't appear in it at all. It's focused upon this poor orphaned boy named Tip, who is basically abused and treated like a slave by his cruel guardian, the witch Mombi, and he runs away from home and goes on a long wandering odyssey to try and find out his true origins. And he finds out that he is really Princess Ozma, the last of the deposed royal family of Oz, who was placed under a cruel curse. Basically, Ozma had all her memories wiped and was transformed from a girl into a boy.
Yeah.
And then given to Mombi. And anyway, Chip, magically gets his memories back and transitions back into a female form and becomes Ozma once again. And yeah, I kid you not. This amazing tale of gender transition, like L. Frank Baum wrote this for children in 1904.
One of the things that I actually find really interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that people have been writing about like gender and anything to do with gender for such a long time. It's just that it's a kind of obscure, or it's in like, Victorian times and things like that. So I think back then that wouldn't be unusual, where now it's like, oh, that's interesting for its time. But I find that super interesting because that's not something that I would think that would be in a book. Then, like, it's so radical.
The Marvelous Land of Oz sold well, but a lot of people thought, geez, this is a bizarre change of direction from the first book. And Baum got a lot of fan mail from people saying, well, what happened to Dorothy? Because he thought the appeal of the book was this fantastical world he created, but he underestimated the fact that a lot of people, the appeal was that they identified with this character. So he brought Dorothy back for the third book. And that's where the film Return to Oz takes most of its plot from. Although it also includes characters from the second book as well. And it adds a whole few things of its own. In the third book, what happens is that after the tornado, Dorothy and her guardians, Uncle Henry and Auntie M, are on a ship bound for Australia. They decide, screw Kansas, let's go to Australia. And the ship that they're on is in a storm, and then that's how Dorothy and the chicken Belina end up being swept away into Oz. So yeah, the whole plot with the asylum is something that they added for the film.
Hmm. One of the things that I was reading about it was some people were like, what are they doing in Australia? And I think of that. That is so random. However, when you look at history and stuff, a lot of people immigrated to Australia. Like it's always been a place that people immigrated to. So reflecting upon that, it didn't seem that weird.
Also, a lot of people like nickname Australia Oz. I was very amused the first time I read Baum's original Oz books and found out that at one point, Dorothy and her family were living in Australia.
Yeah. That's what I thought was cool as well. I'm like, probably obviously not intentional by him, but I thought that was a really quirky coincidence. Yeah, that's just a really cool aspect of it.
I'm sure Baum also didn't intend that, like, I don't know, much of the iconography of Oz would be taken up by the gay rights movement. A lot of people would, I guess, read sort of themes into the relationships. I mean, when Dorothy moves to Oz and becomes best pals with Ozma, the way they talk to each other is full of like gushing declarations of affection and frequent hugging and kisses on the cheek. All this sort of which was quite common at the time. If you look at books like Anne of Green Gables, like the way that these friends express their devotion for each other reads like marriage vows sometimes.
I know, and it's just like in a very, the bosom buddies, I suppose. But it's always like the saying that someone who is gay is a friend of Dorothy's. And so I always thought, like, when I was younger, I was like, I don't really understand that. As I got older, I was like, that's so interesting and just so random.
Well, I think that's another reason perhaps the 1930s film became so iconic, because the actress Judy Garland herself, who played Dorothy, was, quite supportive of gay rights. And in a time long before it was cool. Long before it was cool.
I know. So completely crazy. And then, you've got a daughter, Liza Minnelli, becoming also a gay rights kind of like icon. So it's so weird when you think of that from like Oz and how that actually progressed into society and changing societal norms and things like that. So really interesting.
Which I guess brings us back to why Return to Oz was such a shock to the system. Yeah. In terms of like its imagery being very gothic at times. And, when Dorothy arrives in Oz, she finds that, most of her friends have been turned into stone, and the yellow brick road has been smashed, and the Emerald City has been taken over, and these wheelers, these like punkish characters are hooning around. It is quite a contrast to the, bright, sunny Technicolor aesthetic of the 30s film, which is all a lot of people would have known about Oz.
Yeah. But I think also what I was thinking when I was watching it is that obviously there's a reason for that. Obviously, because it's a much darker tone and everything like that. And, even having with all these monsters, it seemed to be like the idea of shock therapy was more scary than any of these kind of weird creatures in it. Because that seemed to be more scary, I suppose. Because obviously, like Dorothy, there's the threat of getting shock therapy because they think she's crazy and everything like that. But yeah, it doesn't seem as scary as all the really creepy creatures in Oz.
I mean, one of my favorite scenes is early on where she finds a lunchbox tree and takes a lunchbox off the tree, and then the wheelers, who are basically like the hired thugs, the enforcers of Mombi, the new dictator of Oz, chase chase her and give her flack for that. Like, you can't have a free lunch. It's against the rules of the New Order.
I know it's so different, but the Wheelers, like the idea of it actually made me think of Philip Pullman's his Dark Material book, where there are in the second novel, there are these kind of like zebra horse-like creatures, but they have wheels on them. And I know that sounds different, but it popped into my head because I thought, oh my God, this is the weirdest thing that I'm reading. But then actually seeing something that was not similar, but like a similar kind of creation, I was like, this is like a creepy version of Philip Pullman's kind of creatures with wheels and things like that. Although they're pretty scary. Like the Wheelers in Return to Oz, they actually made me think of like a Tim Burton kind of style monster, I suppose. Like sort of like in Beetlejuice. That kind of weird amalgamation of human literal wheels.
You know, sort
A
of
really weird monster.
yeah, these sort of cackling cyborg creatures.
Yeah.
The film tries to sort of draw some parallels between Dorothy's plight in the real world and in Oz by double casting some of the roles. And the Wheelers, I believe they're played by the same group of actors who play the orderlies, the nurses at the hospital, mental institution that she's confined in. And, at one point she's strapped to a trolley and pushed around by these people. And they're the same group of actors who later appear as the Wheelers and, give her a hard time for trying to get a free lunch from the lunchbox tree.
This actually made me think of Labyrinth. When you have all the imagery in Sarah's bedroom, like the stairs and all that, and then when she goes into the labyrinth, it's the same things that are on her wall. So it's sort of like, not exactly the same, but it's sort of like, it's something that was like an idea or something like that has become real. Like yeah.
It's trying to draw parallels as well because the actor who plays the Gnome King in Oz, Nicol Williamson, is the same actor who plays the doctor at the mental institution, and Jean Marsh, the actress who plays the head nurse in the mental institution, is also playing the evil witch Mombi.
This is something that I found really interesting because in The Wizard of Oz, at the end, like, we sort of know that, Dorothy was dreaming and the three sidekicks were the three people who kind of were from the heart and things like that. So in Return to Oz, it seems like, they are actually obviously real people. And it's not just their, it's not that they are imaginary manifestations of the real people. Like, it really seemed like they were different.
Well, the sidekicks are alluded to with certain objects that are in the real world. When Dorothy is admitted into the asylum, it's around Halloween, and people have like pumpkin decorations around their house. So that sort of alludes to Jack Pumpkinhead, who she meets in Oz. And then TikTok has a sort of similar look to the machine, the electroshock machine at the asylum. But yes, the Return to Oz tries to be a bit more ambiguous. Like, I think it tries to have it both ways in like leaving it up to the audience's interpretation as to whether it's real or not. Ozma, the Princess Ozma, appears both in the real world and in Oz. And it's implied in certain scenes that she's been sort of exiled to Earth or something through a magic mirror. And it's Dorothy breaking the enchantment that the Gnome King and Mombi have placed on Oz that lets Ozma come back through the mirror and reclaim her throne.
Well, obviously, she's like the rightful ruler of Oz, and like stowed away, hid away in a mirror and things like that. That also made me think of the idea of mirrors, and made me think of Alice in Wonderland, like Through the Looking Glass. And just that idea of like mirrors having this kind of magical kind of quality or supernatural quality. Like, I don't know if that's a stretch, but I just thought it was interesting. I had made like a mental note of how mirrors have always been used in this sort of way. Like in a long time in literary, books from this time being written and filmed and things like that.
You drawing a parallel between Alice in Wonderland and Wizard of Oz makes me think that Lewis Carroll is probably a closer kin to what L. Frank Baum was doing than a lot of the other authors who perhaps were influenced by Baum, who focused more on the quest side of Dorothy's narrative.
Yeah.
Because Oz is not really a fantasy world with a consistent set of internal logic to it. It's chaotic. And the structure of the storytelling is also in Baum's books. It is very, chaotic and episodic.
Yeah. For me, like it was all jumbled and all different things. However, I didn't think that was a bad thing. I think that was just an interesting narrative style that could have maybe been muddled. And I think I was reading some reviews saying that they didn't like that aspect, but I thought that was cool. I thought it added to the obscurity, the absurdity of the storyline.
It could have been more structured. I think that it sort of mirrors Dorothy's fractured psyche, if you like.
Yeah.
That's my take on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously she has like wasn't traumatic going through all the first time, but it clearly obviously changed her in a way. Like she'd gone on this adventure and then being in the psych ward and stuff like that, that's clearly changed her as well. So if we look at it as the first one being just a representation of her childhood fantasies and things like that, and then Return to Oz as being a representation of her experiences in like the psych ward and things that were done to her, like I think that's what makes it creepy.
I agree. That's a good thematic through line. Although you've hit upon something that I think accounts for why this film has sort of divided critics and divided audiences and wasn't a big hit when it first came out, is that the continuity between this film and the 1930s film is not very neat, in the sense that, like, in their determination to be, I guess, more faithful to the tone and characterization of Baum's books, they sort of flat out contradicted the 1930s film in several key respects. I mean, one of the main things was the casting of Perusa Bulk as Dorothy, who was like 10 or 11 years old. I mean, she was at least 7 years younger than Judy Garland was when she played the role as a teenager. And so, yes, they cast a noticeably younger actress in a story that's supposed to take place after the first story.
Yeah, so obviously as a sequel, she's not supposed to be that young. But the thing is, I was thinking it's not really a true sequel of the film, nor a continuation of the 39 movie. It's its own thing. But I can understand critics being like, oh, maybe it was the wrong casting for the age and things like that. But to me, I didn't care about that.
Well, neither did I, because I think Fairuza Balk actually gave a very affecting, nuanced, quite charismatic performance, really.
Yeah.
She's my favorite depiction of Dorothy on film for a variety of reasons, which I'll probably go into later. But the thing is, the 30s film is what most people know.
Yeah.
The books have become more obscure. And okay, let's say you don't look at this as a sequel to the 30s film, and you just look at it as an adaptation of the books instead. It still plays fast and loose with the plot of those books, and it adds in its own things. As I said, I think it's very true to the tone and the characterization of the books, more so than the 30s film was, but it's not a straight adaptation of those books. And anyone who went into this hoping that it would be, just a scene-for-scene adaptation of the second book would have been very disappointed, I imagine.
One of the things that we've spoken about in the past about adaptations is that sometimes it's okay to not follow the exact scene for scene structure of books or just things that you're adapting. And sometimes things aren't able to be adapted to screen for whatever reasons, we budget or just you just physically can't do that, if it's for whatever reason.
Well, I wonder if the reason why, like, Dorothy being sent to a hospital and then being swept away, rather than going on a cruise ship and being swept away, could have been because it would have been much less expensive to stage it that way, or if it was an artistic decision. It might have been both, really. A happy marriage of convenience. But the thing is that Return to Oz is a sequel, and I think that's what maybe makes it a different case to other adaptations we've talked about, because it's a sequel. You have to go in with some familiarity with what came before. Either you have to have seen the 1930s movie or you have to have read the book. And okay, if you go in with that knowledge, then you have to accept that this is going to be a very different beast, and that the continuity isn't going to be neat. Otherwise, you'll just be like spending the whole movie nitpicking, really.
Yeah. Well, thinking like obviously I've seen the 1930s film. I watched that first. For a lot of people, I've seen that first. But then watching Return to Oz, I was like, yeah, this is clearly different, clearly not really a sequel or anything like that. But that's okay. Like I just thought it's okay. It's okay if it has its own thing. Its own storyline. Well, sort of, slightly different. And that didn't matter to me. Like, we've spoken about like adaptations, and some aren't scene for scene, but it's okay in some cases. It's completely fine because it works, and some things just can't work scene for scene.
Well, yes, sometimes you just have to compromise because of the reality of what can be achieved within a certain budget. And like our very first episode that we did of the podcast of The Neverending Story, when we talked about that movie, that was the case in point. And I would say this was the case here. I'm not sure how much money they had to make this. I know that they have a cast of like not really big movie stars. Like the adult cast are like all respected character actors, but they're not big movie stars, any of them. And Fairuza Balk was a complete unknown. And the director, Walter Murch, it was his first time as a director. He was mainly known as a film editor and sound mixer before this. Among other movies he worked on were The Godfather and Apocalypse Now before this. And this was his only film as a director because it flopped so badly he never got to direct another one, which is kind of sad. He still earned a lot of acclaim as an editor for his like subsequent work on movies like Ghost and The English Patient and stuff. But yes, it's kind of sad because I thought he had a like really interesting eye here.
I thought he had a real creative vision, and someone that could see something that maybe other directors couldn't. In any case, it seems like directors, producers, and things like that, if they don't receive a bunch of accolades, that's like, well, maybe they're not going to be funded. Maybe no one's going to take a chance on them, which is unfortunate. A lot of them are really clever.
Well, there's this old saying in Hollywood: "You're only as good as your last one."
Yeah.
And that probably applies here. But yeah, this film has very interesting like production design and costume design. They're very closely modeled on the original illustrations for the Oz books by John Neal. And Neal actually gets a screen credit in the movie for that.
I made a note that it seemed like they had sort of like 1980s kind of fashion sense, the wheelers and things like that, which I thought was really cool. And they've got, they're wearing like garish kind of outfits, glossy kind of materials, demotic kind of helmets and things like that. So like bike helmets, I guess, that have like the creepy expressions on them. Beard thing coming out of like hair.
I can imagine the Wheelers as this sort of punky new wave band. They were like the opening act for Talking Heads or something.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was really cool, and it was like I thought that was really interesting because it wasn't as if they were straight out monsters. They were these kind of, monsters, yeah, but deeply relatable. Like because they are people, like when they dress in the human clothes and things like that. I
Well,
was like, this is cool.
the clothing made me think of sort of carnival attire in a way, and yeah, the various sort of the dresses for the evil witch Mombi reminded me of like Elizabethan attire, like Elizabeth the First reign, and all of the sort of the palace with the cabinets with all the heads. Did the like whenever she's in a certain mood, she puts on a different head, and there's like this long corridor full of heads in glass cabinets. It's really eerie, and and yeah, they have these sort of collars, and she's got this sort of, as I said, this Elizabethan dress.
And it sounds weird, but it actually made me think of Futurama. And it made me think of that. And I was like, imagine that, but with the Elizabethan collar. And again, it just popped into my mind when I was watching it. And I was like, this is weird. But also, I was like, I've seen this before. Like, I've seen this thing before. But that it was creepy, but also just really interesting. And I liked that they had the Elizabethan attire. Not just because I'm really interested in that era, but like, it just was very striking visually.
Yeah, I agree. And getting onto the sort of non-human characters for a minute, I find it hard to articulate my feelings about this because, in a similar way to Labyrinth, like the puppetry and the claymation is never so convincing that it really seems lifelike. You're always conscious that, oh, here is a puppet, here's a claymation character, but there's just something about it. It has a certain, I don't know. The puppetry has a certain energy to it. The claymation has a kind of vitality, even though, if you look closely, you can see the fingerprints on it. It even so, it impresses me.
Yeah, and I think also, I just didn't really like, I took notice of it, but it didn't bother me because I thought this is really creative. This is really something that you just don't see in a lot of things anymore. Obviously, we have, CGI and a bigger budget and advances in technology and puppetry and things like that. But it kind of made me of like an amalgamation of claymation and puppetry and things like that. Which again, I found it really individual, really creative, and something that stood out because you just don't see that anymore. Little animation and special effects.
Sure, and I think another reason why I found I could accept like all of these crazy sights and sounds is just because of the way the human actors are reacting to all of this.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I have to heap more praise upon Fairuza Balk for carrying this movie on her little shoulders. Because, put it this way, I'm not surprised that she's one of those few child actors who've managed to graduate into adult roles and continue to find steady employment in show business.
She also has such an animated face and she plays creepy roles really well. She has such a distinctive look as well, which you don't really find other people having. There's just something really individual about her. And I think, didn't she win an award? Oh, no, she was nominated for an award for her performance in her nods, like a young artist thing.
It might have been one of those Young Artists Awards. I'm not sure. I was just going to say some of her more famous character parts as an adult in movies like The Craft and American History X, like Bulk has played rather unhinged, borderline psychotic characters. But in Return to Oz, despite Dorothy being admitted to a psych ward and everything, like she's actually sweet without being cloying about it. And I think you hit the nail upon the head when you said she does a lot of like acting without words, a lot of acting with her eyes when Dorothy enters the Emerald City and she looks upon all her old friends turn to stone, and there's like her eyes are starting to tear up. It doesn't seem fake. It doesn't seem like put on. Although it is. I mean, it's all acting, obviously, but more to the point, like the way she acts when she's sharing a scene with one of the puppets or one of the creatures, and the or with or she's like talking to some claymation figure. It's just, it has the same sort of level of intensity and rapport as the scenes back in Kansas where she's talking to Matt Clark and Piper Laurie, the actors who are playing like Uncle Henry and RDM, or the human actors. It's the same level of intensity.
I think people kind of don't talk enough about her acting ability because they're so sort of focused on how, this is so different from Wizard of Oz, a different cast, and a lot of people said, never quite like recaptures the magic of Wizard of Oz, and they kind of overlook like Farouza's kind of acting ability. They overlook so many really good things about the film, and I think that's disappointing.
Well, the poor girl also had to suffer from comparisons to Judy Garland, who is so iconic as well. And one of the things I really appreciate about her performance is the fact that she doesn't try to imitate any of Judy Garland's mannerisms. Like, just imitating her mannerisms would be kind of inappropriate considering the tone of this story for a start. But I really appreciate she really made the part her own in her performance.
And I think that's also what I liked about it, because it, again, not being a direct sequel, not having the exact same characteristics, and also not having the same actor. Judy Garland only did this one film, in the Wizard of Oz kind of world. And so I think that even though some people do compare her to Judy Garland, Farouza, she captures the magic of it in her own way. And having such an expressive face, it just so wonders. Like, I just couldn't look away from her. Whereas in Judy, I just liked it, and I found like her singing and everything was great, and she was very animated. But Farouza brought something that was just a little more intense, but in a good way. Just a little more captivating for me.
I would say that Fairuza Balk's performance was more cinematic and Judy Garland's was more theatrical. Even though Garland was acting in a film, a lot of the films of that era had a more sort of larger than life acting style, a more sort of film was still in its infancy as an art form, you could say, in the 1930s. So they were still, working out how to do a lot of things, and it was from that era. So yes, there are moments where like Judy Garland seems to be playing to the balcony for me, whereas like Bulk's performance seems more subtle, nuanced, and naturalistic. But it's a different acting style that's perhaps representative of a different era in cinema. I
was going to say that as well. Like, it is a very different era, and cinema and like film and things, back in the 30s, 40s, even 50s, just very different.
It's interesting that they got a couple of actors from Britain, Jean Marsh and Nicol Williamson, to play the villains, Mombi and the Gnome King, who were like stage veterans. I mean, they had like respectable film and TV careers, although they probably did like their most acclaimed work on stage. I know for fantasy buffs, like Nicol Williamson had been known as like Merlin in John Borman's film of Excalibur from the early 1980s, and Jean Marsh would later play the evil queen in Willow, another sort of cult 80s film. So we might get to both of those at a later date, perhaps, on this podcast. But in any case, I find it hard to describe what Marsh and Williamson do in this film, because their performances are larger than life. They are a bit theatrical, but they're not quite as over the top as you might expect.
No, do you think it's also because the tone is different? Because they're going for a different tone in the film and, again, making it its own movie?
I think it's also that they're just very different characters to the, cackling, over the top pantomime antics of the Wicked Witch of the West from the 30s film. The Gnome King is a sort of more subtly manipulative character, and he likes to push people's buttons emotionally, rather than like threaten people physically. And the witch Mombi, like once she's taken over Oz, she seems quite happy, just to do her own thing, and you like luxuriate in the hedonistic splendor of her palace. Like she's quite happy so long as she's getting her own way and not really all that demonstrative.
Yeah. Well, I found her a bit like benevolent, but she wasn't. I don't know. It seemed like she had like good intentions, and she didn't seem to want to, ruin things, kidnap people. She didn't have a cackle. Like it seemed her benevolent character, was sincere.
I think saying good intentions is going a bit too far. I think it's just that like a lot of dictators, they keep their inner circle on side by treating them well, by treating them to certain privileges that the lower orders don't get to indulge in. So she lets the Wheelers hoon around the ruins of the Emerald City, keep them on side as her goon squad.
If she wants to control them, if she wants to have influence over them, it's better to what is it? Keep your friends close, your enemies even closer, something like that.
Yeah, that's from the Godfather trilogy.
Yeah. I thought she was good. Like I thought she was interesting, and I thought she obviously actually had character rather than the Wicked Witch in the West. Like, not saying anything against the actress's performance. Can't think of the name. In
Margaret Hamilton played the Wicked Witch of the West in the third film.
Yeah, like I thought she was great, but I thought in Return to Oz, it just a better villain in a way. Yeah, I don't know. I just really liked her. It was cool.
Finally, when it comes to the human actors, I must say that I was pleasantly surprised by Piper Laurie as Auntie M, just because of the kind of roles that I've seen her in the past have usually been very, very dark and malignant a lot of the time. And her Auntie M is actually quite likable and warm and friendly, despite the fact that she sends Dorothy off to a psych ward. She means well.
Well, she was very different from the original, I guess, Aunt M in The Wizard of Oz. Like in that one, she was a bit, obviously grey because of the color, black and white. But she was more homely, I think, in Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the actors' ages. I know that like Piper Laurie looks more middle-aged, whereas I can't remember the name of the actress who played Auntie M in the original, like 1930s Wizard of Oz, but she looked rather elderly, like she could be more of a grandmother rather than an aunt.
That's what I thought as well. And I actually thought it would be easier to say that Dorothy lived with her grandparents. That's sort of the vibe that I got of them as well. And the way that, they're nurturing it seemed like a grandmotherly kind of way. Didn't change anything about the way that I saw it, but that I just found it was interesting that both actors, again, gave their own kind of spin on their character. And I found it was very different.
We keep sort of coming up with that phrase that keeps coming up, its own spin, or this is a new take, or this is something different. Whether or not you can accept Return to Oz, I guess, depends whether you're open to the possibility of a different take, or you want to see it on a different wavelength. I hope that perhaps with the success of Wicked, people will become more enthusiastic about like investigating previous versions of Oz, not just the 1930s film. And they might come across this and Perhaps the way that like Wicked emphasized some of the darker aspects of certain characters might mean that when people come across Return to Oz on Disney Plus streaming or whatever, they might be more open to it. I don't know.
Well, I think like Wicked it's more well known, obviously. But it's because it's been out forever. I'm not really sure when it first came out, like when they first debuted it.
It was the early 2000s anyway.
Yeah. But that's kind of grown as this, cult classic, where I guess Return to Oz is more of actually, no. Wicked has surpassed that cult classic, and I think it's become very mainstream now in its own way. Whereas Return to Oz, I think, is still a cult classic and lesser known. Like, I don't know. I think when you ask people, what films are there of The Wizard of Oz, they'd say The Wizard of Oz and Wicked. I doubt a lot of people would say Return to Oz unless they are like a fan of the books or really big fan of just Baum's writing.
One thing I can say about Return to Oz is that people are very passionate about it. I've met people who love it. I've met people who hated it, and they've been when I've asked them about it, if they've heard of it at all, they're either very vocal in their love or their hate for this film. I've never met anyone who was just kind of indifferent to it. It provokes strong reactions in people, and I don't know. I think you're doing something right if it gets that kind of reaction out of people.
Yeah, and I think also there are so many aspects of it that make it so unique that some people are going to love it and some people are going to hate it for their own reasons. Whether it's because they were surprised that a tone's so different, whether it's because they're literary purists, maybe they just really liked Judy Garland, and wanted a Dorothy that was similar to that. I think it's going to be really divisive between people who watch it. But that's a lot of what you can expect with films that are sequels, especially if it's got different actors in a sequel. It's going to be different.
I must say, speaking for myself, I prefer it when the creative team go out on a limb like this for a sequel.
Yeah.
Rather than just rehashing the same old formula. That's when it feels like a cash grab to me.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of sequels and a lot of remakes out in cinema today. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot of them have the courage that Return to Oz had. And I kind of wish that they did.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point of having courage from the lion. But I think also that is something that, we have spoken about, where a lot of people tend to do straight remakes instead of adapting something that has its own spin. There's a sequel or something, or even it's just an original, screenplay sequel. And we're just so used to people churning out straight adaptations and conversions. So I thought that uniqueness was really interesting and something that I wish that more directors would take a bit of more chance with. But I understand why they don't. Again, we've spoken about it. You just
it didn't make money. That's
it didn't make money. Like, why would you kind of repeat that? A lot of films like that don't make money, which is unfortunate because they appeal to so many people. But we've spoken about it. We get it. We know where they don't. It's just being unfortunate.
I'm glad that at least you and I seem to be on board with this. We could share this together.
Yeah.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.